The sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Promise Creek as Abigail Turner clutched her 3-month-old daughter closer to her chest. The warm June breeze of 1878 offering little comfort against the growing uncertainty in her heart. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to this remote Montana Territory outpost, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride with nothing but hope and desperation driving her forward. "Just a little longer, Eleanor," Abigail whispered to her fussing infant, gently bouncing her while scanning the horizon for any sign of the man who was supposed to meet her. The stagecoach that had delivered her departed hours ago, leaving her alone on the weathered bench outside the territorial post office with nothing but 2 worn valises containing everything she owned in the world. Behind her, the postmaster cleared his throat. "Madam, we're closing up soon." "You sure whoever you're waiting for is coming today?" Abigail straightened her back, maintaining the dignity that had carried her through the scandal of her husband's death and the subsequent discovery of his gambling debts. "Yes, quite certain. Mr. Yates Harrington wrote that he would meet me on the 15th. Today is the 15th. The postmaster's face softened with something resembling pity. "It's getting on to evening, madam. Might be he got held up. Trail can be dangerous this time of year." Abigail nodded stiffly, refusing to contemplate what she would do if her intended husband didn't arrive. The advertisement had seemed heaven-sent when she'd found it 3 months after Eleanor's birth, a cattle rancher seeking a bride, willing to accept a widow with a child. His letters had been straightforward but kind, describing a modest but growing ranch, a 2-story house he'd built with his own hands, and a life that seemed 1,000 times more promising than the destitution she faced in Boston. The baby began to cry in earnest now, her tiny face reddening with effort. Abigail opened her traveling cloak, creating a small shelter to nurse her daughter discreetly. As Eleanor latched on hungrily, Abigail's eyes never stopped scanning the empty street stretching toward the mountains in the distance. Just as the sun began to sink behind the craggy peaks, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Abigail's heart quickened as she adjusted her clothing and gently burped Eleanor against her shoulder. The dust cloud grew larger, finally revealing a single rider on a powerful chestnut stallion. The man who approached was not what she expected. In her mind, she had imagined someone older, weathered by years of hard work. Instead, the rider who slowed his horse before her appeared to be in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and a frame hardened by physical labor. His face was partially obscured by several days' worth of stubble, but his eyes, a striking shade of blue, were immediately visible even from beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. He dismounted with an easy grace that belied his size, removing his hat as he approached. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable in the East, curling slightly at his collar. "Mrs. Turner?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. Abigail nodded, suddenly unable to find her voice. "I'm Yates Harrington." He glanced at the baby in her arms, his expression unreadable. "I apologize for my tardiness. There was trouble with some rustlers on the North Range." Eleanor chose that moment to let out a squeaky yawn, her tiny fist waving in the air. To Abigail's surprise, the corner of Yates's mouth twitched upward. He gestured toward the road from which he'd come. "My wagon's at the livery. I'll fetch it and be back shortly." His eyes met hers steady and clear. "Then we can go home." Those 4 simple words, "let's go home," nearly undid Abigail's carefully maintained composure. Home. She hadn't had a real home since before her husband Frederick's death, when his creditors had claimed everything but her most personal possessions. True to his word, Yates returned within 15 minutes, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 matching gray mares. He loaded her valises with care, then helped her up to the seat, displaying surprising gentleness for hands so clearly accustomed to hard work. As they left Promise Creek behind, Abigail stole glances at her new husband, though they weren't truly married yet, she reminded herself. That would come once they reached his ranch and found a preacher. Yates kept his eyes on the road, occasionally pointing out landmarks or notable features of the landscape. "Have you lived in Montana long, Mr. Harrington?" Abigail asked, desperate to break the silence that had stretched between them. 10 years, came west after the war. His hands were steady on the reins. And it's Yates, please. Yates, she repeated, the name foreign on her tongue, and you may call me Abigail. He nodded, glancing briefly at Alina, who had fallen asleep against her mother's chest. Your daughter, she's very young. 3 months, Abigail confirmed. I mentioned in my letters that she was born after my husband's passing. You did, he agreed simply. Abigail tensed, waiting for questions or accusations that didn't come. Instead, Yates pointed toward a distant ridge. My land starts just beyond that rise. We should be home before dark. As promised, they crested the final hill just as the last rays of sunlight painted the valley in gold. Below them stretched a picturesque homestead. A sturdy 2-story house built of local timber, several outbuildings, corrals containing horses, and in the distance, the dark shapes of cattle grazing on the lush summer grass. It's beautiful, Abigail breathed, surprised by the tears that suddenly pricked her eyes. Yates's expression softened. It's been lonely, he admitted quietly, the first personal revelation he'd offered. But it's good land, fertile, the house has room to grow into. As they approached the ranch house, a tall, lanky man emerged from one of the outbuildings, raising a hand in greeting. That's Samuel, Yates explained. My foreman, only full-time help I keep on, though we hire extra hands during roundup and branding. Samuel approached the wagon as they pulled up before the house. Everything all right in town? Fine, Yates replied. Samuel, this is Mrs. Abigail Turner and her daughter, Alina. Samuel removed his hat, revealing a shock of ginger hair. Madam, little miss, he nodded respectfully. Supper's warming on the stove. Figure you folks might want to get settled. Thanks, Yates said. We'll see you in the morning. After Samuel departed for his quarters above the stable, Yates helped Abigail down from the wagon. Alina woke during the transfer, blinking owlishly at her new surroundings. Let me show you inside, Yates said, carrying both valises in one hand while keeping the other near Abigail's elbow, not quite touching but ready to steady her if needed. The house was larger than it had appeared from a distance. A spacious main room held a stone fireplace, several sturdy pieces of furniture, and to Abigail's surprise, bookshelves filled with volumes. A large kitchen opened off one side with a dining area adjacent. Stairs led to the second floor. Kitchen, parlor, Yates indicated. Pantry's through there, bedrooms are upstairs, he hesitated. There are 3. I've been using the largest. The second has a bed prepared for you. The third is empty now but could be fitted for the child when she's older. Abigail nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had feared much worse accommodations or perhaps expectations that she would immediately share his bed. Instead, he was offering her space, consideration, time to adjust. I'll bring your things up, he said, already moving toward the stairs. Take your time getting acquainted with the house. Supper whenever you're ready. Alone for the first time since their meeting, Abigail slowly circled the main room, taking in details that revealed more about her new husband than his sparse conversation had. The books were well-used classics, history, practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry. A writing desk in one corner held neatly organized papers. Everything was clean, orderly, but definitely masculine. She followed him upstairs, finding her room simply but thoughtfully furnished with a bed, dresser, washstand, and a small table near the window that overlooked the valley. Most surprising was the small cradle positioned near the bed. Yates noticed her gaze. I built it after your last letter, he said, setting her valises by the dresser. If it's not suitable, it's perfect, Abigail interrupted, genuinely moved. Truly, thank you, he nodded once, almost shyly. I'll let you get settled then. After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, Alina cradled in her arms. Well, little one, she whispered, this is a new beginning for us both. The first week at the Harrington ranch established a cautious routine. Yates rose before dawn, working with his cattle and horses until dusk, taking meals quickly before returning to his labors. Abigail threw herself into making the house truly a home, cooking, cleaning, organizing the kitchen to her liking. In the evenings, they shared quiet meals where Abigail gradually drew out small details of his life. She learned he was 34, had fought for the Union during the Civil War, and had come west seeking a fresh start. He'd worked cattle drives, saved his earnings, and gradually built his own operation from nearly nothing. He was educated, surprising her with his knowledge of literature during their evening conversations, but had never found time for a wife until his ranch was established. Why a mail-order bride? She asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Alina slept in a basket beside her chair. Surely there are eligible women even in a territory as sparsely populated as this. Yates considered the question, taking his time as he did with all things. I suppose I'm not much for courting, he finally said, and the women hereabouts are either married too young or— Not to your taste, Abigail supplied when he faltered. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Something like that. He turned the question back to her. And you? There must have been options in Boston besides answering an advertisement from a stranger in the wilderness. Abigail's hands stilled in her lap. After Frederick died and his debts were revealed, there were few respectable options left to me, especially with a child on the way. She met his eyes directly. I told you in my letters that Alina was born after his passing. What I didn't explain is that Frederick had been dead nearly 7 months when she was born. She waited for judgment, condemnation, but Yates merely nodded. I had calculated as much, and it doesn't concern you. The circumstances of her birth aren't her doing, he said simply. Nor would I presume to judge yours. 2 days later, Reverend Michaels from Promise Creek arrived to perform their wedding ceremony. It was a simple affair with only Samuel and the Reverend's wife as witnesses. Abigail wore her best dress, a sage green traveling outfit that had seen better days, while Yates appeared in clean denims and a crisp white shirt, his hair still damp from washing. The ceremony was brief, the Reverend's words echoing in the main room of the house that was now legally hers as well. When the time came for Yates to kiss his bride, he hesitated, then leaned forward to place a gentle, chaste kiss on her lips, their first physical contact beyond the occasional steadying hand. That night, after a celebratory meal where even the normally reserved Samuel offered a toast to their happiness, Abigail prepared for bed with trembling hands. She and Yates had not discussed sleeping arrangements following the ceremony, and she wasn't certain what to expect. A knock at her door startled her. She clutched her robe tighter and opened it to find Yates standing in the hallway, similarly dressed for sleep in drawers and a nightshirt. I wanted to say, he began, then stopped himself. That is, I want you to know that I don't expect. That is to say, there's no rush for. Abigail felt a surprising wave of tenderness for this man who could face down cattle rustlers and carve a living from the wilderness, yet stumbled over expressing his feelings. Thank you, she said softly. Perhaps we could take time to know one another better first. Relief washed over his features. Yes, that's what I hoped you might say, he paused. Good night, Mrs. Harrington. Her new name sent a strange flutter through her chest. Good night, husband. The summer days stretched long and golden as July turned to August, and Abigail settled deeper into ranch life. Alina thrived in the clear mountain air, growing plumper and more alert. Yates, initially awkward around the baby, gradually began to show interest, watching her developmental progress with the same careful attention he gave to his livestock. The first time he held Alina came unexpectedly one evening when Abigail was struggling to prepare dinner while the baby fussed. Without a word, Yates crossed the kitchen and held out his arms. May I? He asked. Surprised, Abigail transferred the squirming infant to his large hands. She expected awkwardness, but Yates cradled Alina with natural ease, supporting her head properly as he walked her around the kitchen, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. You've held babies before, Abigail observed. Had 4 younger siblings, he answered, gently bouncing Alina when she hiccuped. Ma needed help. You've never mentioned your family before. A shadow crossed his face. Lost my parents and 2 sisters to typhoid in '63 while I was fighting at Gettysburg. Brother died at Appomattox just before the surrender. I'm so sorry, Abigail said, her heart aching for the losses he'd carried silently. It was a long time ago, he replied, but his arms tightened protectively around Alina. After that evening, something shifted between them. Yates began making time to be with them beyond meals, sometimes adjusting his work schedule to spend afternoons with Abigail and Alina. He started bringing small gifts, wildflowers from the high meadow, a particularly beautiful river stone, once even a tiny carved wooden horse for Alina when she was older. For her part, Abigail found herself watching for his return each evening with increasing anticipation. She took extra care with meals and her appearance, and caught herself smiling more frequently than she had in years. The peaceful security of ranch life was healing something long broken inside her. One evening in late August, they sat together on a blanket near the creek that ran through the property, watching the sunset while Alina slept beside them. The day had been particularly fine, and Yates had finished his work early to take Abigail on a proper tour of his land, nearly 600 acres of valleys, forests, and high meadows. "I never imagined such beauty existed," Abigail said, watching as the mountains turned gold then pink in the fading light. "In Boston, everything was so crowded, so contained. And do you miss it?" Yates asked, a note in his voice she couldn't quite identify. "The theaters, shops, society." Abigail considered the question honestly. "I miss certain conveniences," she admitted. "Running water, easy access to a doctor, but the rest," she shook her head. "After Frederick died, Boston held nothing but painful memories and closed doors." Yates was quiet for a long moment, plucking a stem of grass and twirling it between his fingers. "I've been meaning to ask about him. Your first husband." Abigail tensed. She had shared little about Frederick, preferring to leave that chapter of her life closed. But Yates had been nothing but honest with her. "We married when I was 18, she began hesitantly. "He was charming, handsome, from a good family. My parents were thrilled with the match," she sighed. "What none of us knew was that he had a weakness for gambling and drink. He hid it well at first, but after my father died and my mother followed soon after, there was no one to keep him in check." "He mistreated you?" Yates asked, his voice carefully neutral, though she noticed his hand had tightened into a fist. "Not physically," Abigail clarified. "But there were other cruelties, lies, broken promises. Other women, I suspect, though he was discreet. Mostly it was the constant fear of what new disaster his vices would bring. And Alina's father," the question she had dreaded since their first correspondence hung in the air between them. Abigail looked down at her sleeping daughter, then met Yates's steady gaze. "After I discovered the extent of Frederick's debts, I confronted him. We argued terribly. He stormed out to his club and didn't return that night." She swallowed hard. "The next day, I learned he'd been killed in a dispute over cards. A week later, I realized I was with child." Understanding dawned in Yates's eyes. "Alina is Frederick's daughter." "Yes," Abigail whispered, "but society," they counted months. "They whispered that she couldn't be his, that I must have been unfaithful. No one would help the widow of a debtor, especially one suspected of adultery." To her surprise, Yates reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch incredibly gentle. "Thank you for telling me the truth." "I should have told you sooner," she admitted. "In my letters, I implied you told me what I needed to know," he interrupted. "That you needed a fresh start, that your daughter needed a home." His fingers tightened around hers. "I'm glad you came, Abigail." The simple sincerity in his voice melted something inside her. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their wedding kiss, this one lingered, deepened as Yates's free hand came up to cup her cheek. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed. "What stopped you?" "I wanted you to be sure, to choose me, not just the security I could provide." That night, Abigail moved her things into the master bedroom, and Alina's cradle as well. Their lovemaking was tender, unhurried, a mutual exploration that left them both trembling and amazed in the aftermath. As they lay tangled together in the darkness, Yates traced patterns on her bare shoulder with his fingertips. "I never thought to find this," he murmured. "Someone to share everything with." Abigail pressed closer to his warmth. "Nor I, especially not after everything that happened." The peaceful routine of their new life was interrupted in early October when Samuel burst into the house one morning, his face grave. "Rustlers, boss. They hit the north pasture last night. Took at least 30 head. Yates's expression hardened. Same ones as this summer, Samuel nodded grimly. Tracks lead toward the Blackwater Canyon. That's Sela's rider's territory. Who is Sela's rider? Abigail asked, clutching Alina closer as a sense of foreboding washed over her. Outlaw, Yates explained tersely, already moving toward where his gun belt hung. Been terrorizing ranchers up and down the territory for 2 years now. Law can't catch him because he hides in the canyon lands where no posse can follow. What are you going to do? Abigail asked, fear evident in her voice. Yates checked his revolver before holstering it. Track them. Try to recover our cattle. If we're lucky, the territorial marshal might be in Promise Creek. He's been hunting Ryder for months. And if you're not lucky, Abigail pressed, following him to the door. Yates paused, then turned back to cup her face in his hands. I'll be careful, he promised. Those cattle represent our winter supplies and next year's breeding stock. I have to try. He kissed her thoroughly, then bent to press his lips to Alina's forehead. Take care of your mama, little one, he whispered. I'll be home as soon as I can. Abigail watched from the porch as Yates and Samuel rode away, followed by 3 other men from neighboring ranches who had also lost cattle. The knot of dread in her stomach tightened as they disappeared over the ridge. 3 days passed with no word. Abigail moved through her tasks mechanically, jumping at every sound that might herald Yates's return. On the 4th morning, she was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and ran toward the front of the house, hope blooming in her chest. The rider who appeared was not Yates, but a young man she recognized from town, the telegraph operator's son. Mrs. Harrington, he called, dismounting quickly. Madam, I've got news. Your husband's been shot. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Is he? She couldn't form the terrible question. He's alive, madam, the young man assured her quickly. They brought him to Doc Miller's in town yesterday. The marshal's posse caught up with the rustlers in Blackwater Canyon. There was a shootout. Your husband took a bullet meant for the marshal. I have to go to him, Abigail said, already moving toward the house to gather what she would need. Yes, madam, Doc sent me to fetch you, said Mr. Harrington's been asking for you something fierce. Within 30 minutes, Abigail had packed necessities for herself and Alina, saddled the gentlest mare from the corral, and secured Alina to her chest with a length of fabric in the manner she'd seen some of the local women carry their babies. The ride to Promise Creek was tense, the young telegraph operator leading the way and frequently checking to ensure she was managing. Doc Miller's office was at the far end of town, a neat whitewashed building with green shutters. The territorial marshal himself was seated on the porch and stood as they approached. Mrs. Harrington, he greeted, helping her dismount. Your husband's a brave man, saved my life and helped us finally capture Sela's rider. How badly is he hurt? Abigail asked, clutching Alina tightly. Bullet went clean through his shoulder, the marshal explained, escorting her inside. Lost blood, but Doc says he'll mend if infection doesn't set in. Yates was pale against the white sheets of the treatment room's single bed. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged and a sheen of sweat covered his forehead, but his eyes were clear when they opened at the sound of her approach. Abigail, he breathed, relief evident in his voice. His gaze moved to Alina, secure against her chest. And Alina, you're both all right. We're fine, she assured him, moving to his bedside and carefully taking his uninjured hand. It's you we've been worried about. Caught them, he said, a hint of satisfaction in his weak voice. Got most of the cattle back, Ryder's going to hang. I don't care about any of that, Abigail said fiercely, tears spilling down her cheeks. I care about you coming home to us. Doc Miller, a grizzled older man with kind eyes, stepped into the room. Your husband needs rest, Mrs. Harrington, but he's past the worst of it. I'd like to keep him here another day or two to watch for fever, then he can go home if you've got a wagon to transport him gently. Samuel will bring the wagon tomorrow, Abigail said decisively. I'm staying until then. For 5 days after bringing Yates home, Abigail barely left his side, changing bandages, coaxing broth and medicine into him, reading aloud from his favorite books when restlessness made him irritable. Samuel took over the essential ranch operations. and neighbors grateful for Yates's role in capturing the rustlers who had plagued them all dropped by with food and offers of assistance. By the second week, Yates was strong enough to sit on the porch, watching as Abigail hung laundry or worked in the kitchen garden she had established over the summer. Often, she would catch him simply studying her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What are you thinking when you look at me that way?" She finally asked one crisp October afternoon as she joined him on the porch swing, Eleanor sleeping in the crook of her arm. "I'm thinking how close I came to losing this," he answered honestly. "When Ryder had that gun aimed at the marshal, all I could think about was getting home to you and Eleanor." Abigail leaned her head against his good shoulder. "When I got word you were hurt, I realized something I should have told you before you left." "What's that?" "That I love you," she said simply. "Not just for the home you've given us or the security. I love you, Yates Harrington, your strength, your gentleness, your quiet ways." He turned carefully to face her, his blue eyes intense. "I've loved you since I first saw you sitting on that bench in town, holding your baby and looking both terrified and determined all at once." He touched Eleanor's cheek with one gentle finger. "And I love this little one as if she were my own blood." "She is your daughter in every way that matters," Abigail said, her throat tight with emotion. Yates nodded, then reached into his pocket with his good hand. "I had this made in town before the rustling incident, meant to give it to you when I got back." He produced a simple gold band. "To replace the temporary ring from our wedding, I hoped you might want something permanent." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as he slipped the ring onto her finger beside the plain band they'd used for the ceremony. "It's beautiful." "I had the inside engraved," he said, a hint of shyness in his voice. Abigail removed the ring to read the inscription, "Home at last." "Because that's what you are to me," Yates explained, his voice husky with emotion. "What you both are, home." As winter settled over the Montana territory, blanketing the Harrington ranch in pristine white, the house glowed with warmth and new life. Yates's shoulder healed completely, leaving only a scar to remind them of how precious their time together was. Eleanor grew rapidly, babbling her first words and taking tentative steps that had Yates building gates for the stairs and securing bookshelves to walls. On Christmas morning, with snow falling gently outside, Abigail placed Yates's hand on her still flat stomach. "Another gift," she whispered. "Come summer." The joy that illuminated his face was all the confirmation Abigail needed that the long journey from Boston, the uncertainty, the fear, the leap of faith answering a stranger's advertisement had led exactly where she was meant to be. As they stood before the fire, Eleanor playing with wooden blocks at their feet and the promise of new life growing between them, Abigail remembered that moment on the bench in Promise Creek, waiting with her baby in her arms when a dusty cowboy had ridden in and said those simple, life-changing words, "Let's go home." She hadn't understood then what home truly meant. Now, wrapped in Yates's strong arms, watching their daughter for Eleanor was truly theirs now. Abigail Turner Harrington finally knew. Home wasn't a place. It was this love, this family, this life they were building together on the wild frontier.